Hello, everyone. Welcome to our SummerHacks speaker series. This is the first event we're holding, and hopefully a long line of really great speakers that we hope to have here for y'all. As always, this event, if we're unable to make it live, is going to be recorded. So if you have to leave in the middle, no worries. We'll post it later and send out a link to everybody. Today, our speaker is Rushi Shah. He is someone I have known for the past 2 years. He studied at UT, just graduated, and is going to be a future grad student at Princeton and Harvard. So Rushi, would you care to introduce yourself really quickly?
Yeah, definitely. So my name's Rushi. I am a Turing Scholar. I just graduated from UT with computer science and math as my majors. And I will be doing a PhD in computer science and a JD, which is a law degree from Harvard Law School. The idea here is to kind of do a joint degree at the intersection of technology and law. So yeah, I can kind of get a little bit into how I arrived at that decision, or?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's just get right into it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. All right, go for it.
Yeah, so basically when I got to college freshman year, I took a class called Discrete Math with Professor Ishil Dillig, and she's a really great researcher in the field of programming languages. So I read a couple of her papers like the night before the first day of class, and I was like, whoa, this is like so cool. So I reached out to her about doing research with her, and she was like, oh yeah, like just take programming languages next year. And I was like, okay, cool. But that didn't really seem like a very immediate thing that I could do. It seemed like really far down the line. So I was talking to one of the kind of upperclassmen in Turing. His name is Jacob Van Geffen, who was already doing research with Ishil. And I asked him like, oh yeah, I tried to do research with her, but there wasn't anything I could really do. And he was like, oh, Ishil, like you just haven't bothered her enough. Like just ask her again. And I was like, okay, sounds good. So then I went into her office hours one day and I was like, hey, I know that you mentioned that I should take programming languages, but I'm really interested in research right now. Is there anything I can do to get started like right now? That's not necessarily multiple semesters in the future. She's like, oh yeah, definitely. Like, let me talk to one of my postdocs and get back to you this evening.
And this was when you were a freshman?
Yeah, this was when I was a freshman. And that evening she emailed me and she was like, hey, I'm introducing you to this postdoc. His name is Ruben, and he'll get you up and running in programming languages research. And so basically what happened was for like a whole year, Ruben, who had basically was wrapping up his postdoc, so he was relatively free, he was able to just mentor me kind of one-on-one for like an hour a week on programming languages research. So he would give me a paper to read, I would read it, and then I would come and be like, oh, this is what I understood out of it. And he'd be like, kind of. And then he would like explain the rest of the paper to me. So I was really lucky to have good mentors in the beginning between Jacob, Ishil, and Ruben, who all were really instrumental in getting me up and running in a field that like initially seemed really unapproachable to me. So anyways, after that, I did research with Ishil for about 3 years. And that was a really, really formative experience for my undergrad career. I ended up publishing 2 different papers with her at top tier conferences and spent ultimately 1 summer and pretty much every semester researching. So I can definitely get into that a little bit, but that was one whole aspect of my undergrad career, was doing research with Ishil. And I also did research in a couple of other fields. But that kind of fits in the category of things that made me start thinking about getting a PhD in computer science after I graduated. So on the other end, I also did some industry internships. So the summer after my freshman year, I did a internship with a software consulting company called Originate in New York City. And then the summer after my sophomore year, I did an internship with Amazon in their Tokyo, Japan office. And then the summer after my junior year, I stayed at UT over the summer to do research with Ishil. So basically kind of what I realized during the summers was that I was not super interested in industry and I couldn't really see myself being a full-time software engineer. And that kind of started pushing me towards academia and getting a PhD in computer science. So anyway, I'll kind of pause here. That's kind of, I got involved in research. I got involved in like industry internships and stuff. Started to realize internships weren't for me and got more involved in research. And that was definitely a process over the course of the 3 years. So
So what was, if I can interject here, what were some of the things about industry that you kind of shied away from a little?
Yeah, one of the things that early on really convinced, okay, so first thing was my first summer after freshman year, I got to go to a research conference, and the research conference I attended was PLDI 2017, and I found it to be really, really interesting. I got to hear a lot of talks from people who were like really passionate about their work. They were talking about their research and being like, oh, you know, like I did this, I did this, I did this, and this is why all of this is interesting. That really appealed to me because the people were really invested in the work that they were doing for themselves. And I contrasted that with my experience in industry, which to me felt that it was kind of more top down. There was a project that needed to get done, and there would be a team of people working on it, kind of like more or less regardless of whether or not it aligned with their interests. If it aligned with the company's goals, that was the project they would work on. So in the beginning, one thing that really appealed to me about research was the idea of this like intellectual freedom and being able to pursue whatever projects you find interesting. Yeah, so I would say that's kind of one of the first things that started pushing me towards that. And so as a result, I started considering like, oh, I started doing programming languages research with Ishel, and that was really good for me. But are there other research fields that I might be interested in as well? So I took a lot of classes. I took a computer security class with Hovav Shaham at UT. That was really influential. And then I took a computer architecture, research in computer architecture class with Calvin Lin.
Oh, I took that one.
Also really,
that's a good one.
Yeah. We were in the same class. Yeah. So.
Oh, we were. Good time.
Yeah, so I felt like those were both really influential classes. I was able to do kind of a research project as a part of the class, smooshed into like one semester, not necessarily publishable, but something that I could A, talk about on my grad school applications, and B, get a sense for what that subfield of computer science really values. So yeah, so I did that. Those were some of my academic computer science research projects that I got involved in. And I liked them more or less, so kind of I was full steam ahead on applying to PhD programs. Then this whole law degree thing, which kind of came out of left field. So I took a class called Cybersecurity Law and Policy at UT, which is technically a law school class restricted to UT law students. But because the Professor Robert Chesney, is awesome, he has gone really out of his way to cross-list it as a class in other disciplines as well. So it's listed as a public policy class for UT public policy grad students. And then it's also listed as a UT computer science grad class, which if you're a UTCS student is really convenient to get registered for because it's literally just filling out one form to take a grad class as a CS student at UT.
Yeah. With professor approval or something, right?
Yeah, with professor approval. So that actually ties into my story. So basically I needed to fill out this one form to get into this class. And so I emailed him. He was like, hell yeah, let's do it. I'm super excited to have you in my class. I love the idea of having CS people in my class. So I went to talk to him one day and he was like, oh, cool. Like he was signing my form and he was like, so like, what are your plans after graduation? And I was like, oh, I'm planning to apply to PhD programs in computer science. And he was like, have you ever considered doing a JD PhD, which is, again, a law degree and a PhD? And I was like, no, can you do that? And he was like, yeah, definitely. Like, that's definitely like a space that we need people with expertise in both fields in. So you should maybe look into it.
So that's sorry, just to clarify. So that's like it's a PhD except specifically for law. And
no, sorry. It's a PhD in computer science. And then the law degree is called a JD, like Juris Doctorate.
Sure.
So you get a PhD degree in computer science, and then you get a JD degree in law, which is like the terminal degree in law.
Oh, so you're speaking about two separate degrees here.
Yeah, it's two separate degrees that you kind of merge together.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so he was like, oh, you should do like a JD plus PhD. I was like, oh, definitely. Let me think about it. And so I went home. I thought about it. Getting a law degree is something that I had toyed with a lot throughout my life, but never really felt like it was on the table. I felt like there were three things I needed to apply to law school. Like I needed a good reason to go to law school. I needed a admissions exam score, and I needed like letters of recommendation in the law field. And all of a sudden, by talking to Chesney, I felt like I had kind of gotten two of them. I had gotten a really good reason. His class, cybersecurity law and policy, was really interesting to me. I really enjoyed it, and I learned a lot. And I was like, oh, there's very clear intersections here that I could research in my PhD and learn about the law aspects in my law degree. So that was kind of my reason to go to law school. And then kind of letters of recommendation, I had found one, like Professor Chesney, like after I took his class, would be a really strong letter of recommendation after going to office hours and stuff like that. Right. So then at the end of the day, I still needed an exam score. And I was like, okay, I suddenly went from like having 3 things holding me back to having only 1 thing holding me back. Let me see what I can do, and let me try to study for this exam. Mm-hmm. So I took the class, I studied for the exam really hard, and I decided to apply. What's up?
Could you speak about the timeline a little bit? So at what point did you take the class, and when did the exam have to happen?
Yeah, so I took the class the fall semester of my senior year. So super late, right?
Right.
At this point, I already knew that I was applying to PhD programs that semester. Mm-hmm. I decided to start applying to law schools, which like doubles the amount of schools I need to apply to, basically.
Right.
And I had already taken the GRE, which is like the admissions exam for PhD programs, but I needed to suddenly take the LSAT, which is a in my opinion, much more difficult exam. So I took the class in the fall. I studied for the LSAT in the fall. And so I had this conversation with Chesney like a week before classes started, when I was filling out paperwork and stuff to get into this class. I took the LSAT on October 28th, and I applied to law schools, and I applied to PhD programs by like December 3rd, and I applied to law schools by like the end of December.
Wow.
The interesting point here is that because these joint degree programs are like not established, I basically had to apply independently to PhD programs and independently to JD programs. So
including maybe at the same school. So was there a single school that you applied to both programs for?
Yeah, pretty much every school I applied to law school, I also applied to the PhD program.
Gotcha.
So that was super interesting. Now I feel very qualified to talk on PhD applications because I did that, and then JD applications because I did that. But I imagine what's probably more relevant here is talking about PhD applications in general, which I can also kind of restrict most of my conversations towards that from now on. And if you want more information about JD applications, feel free to like reach out to me directly, and I'd be happy to chat about that too.
Yeah. I think that's a great idea, given that most of our viewers are probably computer science. But I would like to hear a little bit about your JD experience as well, because I think, really what makes you unique in terms of not just being any other grad student, at least from my perspective, is that you're doing these cool 2 degrees at the same time. So I want to hear a little more about like the combined aspect of it.
Yeah. So to give a little bit of context, there has been a couple of people who have done both JDs and PhDs in computer science. JD PhDs in other fields are like pretty common. Like JD PhD in history, super common. JD PhD in, I don't know, something else, like super common. Yeah, government, stuff like that, super common. There have also been people who get JDs and PhDs in computer science. A whole swath of them kind of do them completely separately. So like people might have gotten a JD and then decided to become computer scientists and gotten a PhD in computer science or something like that. The person that comes to mind when you think of someone who did the 2 programs at the same time is my future PhD advisor, Jonathan Mayer. So Jonathan Mayer did a JD PhD joint degree program at Stanford. He did that whole thing, and now he is a professor at Princeton, professor of computer science at Princeton. So I reached out to him. Okay, first I reached out to Hovav Shaham, who is the computer security professor that I mentioned earlier at UT. He was going to already be one of my letters of recommendation for PhD programs, and I was like, hey, I'm kind of interested in this. Turns out his brother is a lawyer. That was kind of interesting. So he knew a little bit about it from that. But he was really supportive also in kind of finding what that niche between computer security and law was.
Right.
So in my applications, I talked a lot about like voting machine security, and like what the institutional level support needs to be for computer security for democracy, basically. So I reached out to Jonathan Mayer, and he very graciously answered a ton of my questions over email. And I realized that he would be a really, okay, so like obviously in his email, right, he was like, oh, you should apply to Princeton as a PhD program. And I was like, yeah, I'm planning to. But also that kind of indicated to me that he was a really good fit for a PhD advisor for me. So let me go over some of the things that he mentioned in his email. So one of them was that you have to do the whole applying to do different programs thing independently. The other thing was that you should, if you're, at the end of the day, the PhD is a much longer degree. So a PhD typically takes like 5 to 6 years to complete. A JD is a 3-year degree. So one thing that he rightfully mentioned is that, like, look, if you're kind of looking at these trade-offs, definitely prioritize the PhD program and find a good PhD program fit, because it's going to make up such a larger portion of your graduate school experience, which is why one of the reasons that I think that I can definitely talk to like how to pick a good PhD program, which I think is one thing that a lot of people are like kind of curious about.
I would love to hear about that if you have the time today.
Yeah. Yes. So the biggest thing is, how do you pick a PhD program for you? Even if you, let's say you have decided that you want to apply to PhD programs, now how do you figure out which ones to apply to, and like figure out what field to apply to, and then within that field figure out which schools to apply to, and then within the schools figure out which professors you would like to work with. Okay. So there's like 3 kind of huge things that you have to figure out about yourself. So number 1, what field do you want to be working in? In my undergraduate experience, I did programming languages for a majority of my research. Those like programming languages venues were where I was published in. My primary advisor was in programming languages. My thesis was in programming languages. I was like very much a programming languages guy. You need to find 3 letters of recommendation for computer science programs, computer science PhD programs. The first one is going to be the advisor that you do your biggest projects with. The second one is kind of like, the second and third are kind of like professors that you've done large class projects with who can speak to your research ability. The important thing is that those professors can speak specifically to not how you do in their class, but how you do as a researcher, because PhD programs in computer science are entirely research apprenticeships. You should think of it as, I'm going to spend like 6 years doing research, so that then that way when I graduate, I can do more research. And so that's kind of like the mentality that you should go into it with. A quick word, PhDs are like not super helpful for going back into industry if you know before you get the PhD that you want to go into industry, because spending 6 years just working your way up the corporate ladder will be just as effective as whatever boost you get having a PhD coming in. So they're really research apprenticeships. So you need to figure out what field you want to be doing that in. And the best way is to try a variety of research areas in undergrad. And in the process of doing so, you will research with professors who will ultimately become your letters of recommendation for grad school. So that's really helpful. I realized that, hey, I did my biggest projects in programming languages, but actually in grad school, I'm much more interested in computer security. This is kind of like iffy, right? Because as a programming languages student, I am very qualified. My professor is very well respected in her field. Everybody knows her name. That's great. Her letter of recommendation will go a long way. Pivoting into computer security is kind of a harder sell, because the computer security people, their research is just fundamentally different from programming languages research. So it was definitely a risk to be kind of switching fields. And I think that it was definitely worth it for me, because of all the times to switch, it's good to switch as you're transitioning from undergrad to grad school. But on the other hand, it's also very scary because it introduces a lot of uncertainty into your grad school applications.
Would you say it would have been better to switch prior to, if you had maybe known about it before, maybe say junior year?
No, so I I thought about it by junior year, which is one of the reasons why I was trying out this research in these different fields.
Gotcha.
So by junior year, I was doing computer security research, and I was like, oh, I actually really like this. I don't think there's gonna be one primary advisor, and if that primary advisor that you have in undergrad is not in the field you want to be in, there's not much you can do. Like, you can't find a new primary advisor. You can only have like your second or third letter of recommendation come from the new field that you want to be in.
Mm-hmm.
So for transparency's sake, if I had applied to programming languages programs, I think that I would have been accepted at a lot more programs, because it would have been easier for potential advisors to see that I had done research in that field before and I would succeed in the future.
Right.
So
would you say that your programming languages research still helped your application, even though you're applying for security?
Yeah, definitely. Like, you have to have research in some field in order to apply to PhD programs, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And so it definitely helped to have something. I think it just made it a harder sell for some of the, like, finding a student who has 2 publications in a computer security venue is going to be stronger than me as an applicant who has 2 publications in programming languages, like just baseline, you know? And like, PhDs don't accept that many students per year anyway, so you kind of have to account for that. So then after you figure out what field you want to be in, and you account for the fact that getting into that field from the field that you're currently in might be kind of difficult, then you have to figure out, okay, which schools do I apply to? Applying to schools will be largely determined by, you should talk to the advisor in the field that you want to be in. So for example, I talked to Ishal about programming languages schools. She told me a bunch of them. She also had a vague idea about which computer security schools I should apply to. But at the end of the day, I also talked to Hovav Shaham, and he was able to point me in the direction of other very good computer security professors. And this gets me to my third point, which is that you have to kind of apply to specific professors. What I mean by that is you'll have to write a personal statement. And in that personal statement, in the last paragraph, it is conventional to include the names of 2 or 3 professors who you would potentially work with at the school that you're applying to. Your advisor is going to be the one who tells you the best people to put there, because there's a lot of like inside baseball that you might not know about. For example, a professor might be like, on their website, be like, oh yeah, I'm accepting students, whatever. Turns out they've been on sabbatical for 3 semesters.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they're not reading applications this semester. You can mention them, but they're not going to accept you, so that's not a good idea. Same thing, like the professors who you see have published a lot of papers, that's cool. They're probably like pretty senior professors, and they can have a lot more responsibilities in terms of like chairing committees, reviewing papers for acceptance at conferences, et cetera, and that can make them less strong advisors for you because they have less time to dedicate to you.
Right.
So basically you need to figure out who the professors that you want to apply to are, and the best place for that information is from your advisor and from like kind of a word of mouth thing. So after that, you will have figured out what schools you want to apply to. You will have found 3 letters of recommendation. Letters of recommendation are the largest part of your PhD application, by far, hands down.
Really?
So it's like, if you have publications, and that's great. If you have publications, that's great. You don't need publications by any means. What you need is having done some research. You can have began a project and ran into some roadblocks that ended up leading it to not get published. That's fine. As long as you started that path with a professor, they will be able to speak to how you conduct research on a day-to-day basis. Like, oh, you know, they try their best to make progress every single day. Whenever I give them reasonable deadlines, they're able to meet those reasonable deadlines. Like, stuff like that is what potential advisors want to see coming from your previous advisor. And then you'll have a personal statement where you'll write about the research that you did. You need to be able to like kind of coherently express what you've done so far, which is obviously an important skill. And there you want to be able to talk about projects that you did, which can be reinforced by the professors who say, you know, I know they said in their personal statement that they did A, B, and C. Me as a third party can confirm that they did in fact do A, B, and C, and they did A, B, and C very well, which is going to be making your application much stronger. So identify professors in undergrad to do research with and start doing that research, and then talk to them about applying to grad school if you're interested, and they will be able to kind of guide you through the process much more easily. So yeah, I did that. I was accepted at a handful of schools, including my first choice, which was Princeton. I knew going in that Princeton was my first choice because the potential PhD advisor, Jonathan Mayer, was a very strong fit for what I wanted to do, which was a JD PhD.
So your objective was to do both of them from Princeton?
No, so this is funny. Princeton has no law school. It has no law school. It never has.
Interesting.
Which is funny. Like, the joke is that, like, you see, like, if you just poll like 50 random Americans and you're like, oh, where do you think Princeton law ranks? They'll be like, oh, like top 5, top 10. But like,
naturally, that's what I would have said.
Yeah, they could. Princeton could, like, the joke is that, like, oh, Princeton could hire 3 law professors tomorrow and start off like top 5 law schools, but like they just don't have one yet. Or they don't have one as a design decision. Like, I don't think they have any plans to make a law school anytime soon. So yeah, so that was kind of like a dilemma for me, was like, oh, like, I really want to work with this PhD advisor, but like they don't have a law school. So I kind of just like pushed that to the back of my mind. I knew it was my first choice PhD program, applied everywhere, and everything kind of worked out eventually, which I can get to talking about later. But yeah, so I was accepted at a handful of schools, including Princeton, which was my first choice. I was also rejected from a good number of schools. And if I had to identify the reasons why I think I was rejected, I think the biggest weakness in my application was that I was trying to switch research fields without having significant research experience in the field that I wanted to go into. So like, one class project, that's great. One letter of recommendation from that field, that's great. And that was enough to get me into some schools, but it was also enough to get me rejected from some other schools. So definitely, like, recognize that PhD programs are competitive, and like, if you're applying, definitely go for it. But like, recognize that like you will perhaps get rejected from some places, and that's fine. And you just have to like do the best that you can with like where you're accepted.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
So about your field change from programming language to security, right? Would you mind talking about your specific reason for it, and then also whether or not it might have played a factor? Because I feel like programming languages is a little harder to merge with law than cybersecurity is, right? So how much of a factor do you think that played?
I think that's like almost the entire factor.
Okay.
So like towards the end of my programming languages career or whatever, what I felt was that my work was not really impacting real people's day-to-day lives. It was impacting a small subset of people who were using the tools that I was making. And like, yeah, it was making their life more convenient by not having to do database migrations, for example. But like there are people who live very different lives, who have very different problems that are like much more all-encompassing in their life. And like, I wanted to be able to address kind of these more human problems. So that's what got me interested in law, and looking for places that intersected with computer science. I identified computer security as like, there are really good applications for computer science security. There's privacy concerns. There is computer security for like democracy things. There is like surveillance against marginalized communities that really needs to be addressed. There's like algorithmic risk assessments for people being held in pretrial incarceration. They haven't been found guilty of a crime yet, but they're still in jail. There's like algorithms trying to address that, but like those algorithms are kind of biased, racially biased against Black people just based on the history of incarceration in America. So like there are all these problems that I felt like were much more interesting than like saving a programmer 5 minutes on a programming language's task.
Sure.
In my opinion.
Yeah.
So anyways, yeah, so that's how I decided that I wanted to kind of find a new area to go into. Computer security was kind of one avenue. Even without law, I think that there's a lot of interesting work that can be done in computer security. And with law, I think that it makes a particularly strong combination.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about, I'm curious to hear about your specific situation. How did you decide to do Princeton for your PhD and then Harvard for your JD? And how do you plan to make that work?
Yeah, so, okay. So one thing that's worth mentioning is, this is actually a great point. So for computer science programs, there is, if you Google it, like a ranking for the computer science programs across the country. That ranking can be perhaps useful, but it should absolutely be taken with a grain of salt based on your individual situation. At the end of the day, you're going to be spending 6 years with 1, potentially 2 advisors at whatever institution you go to, and definitely 1 research group, which is like 30 people or smaller. The school writ large, the computer science department writ large, might have 500 plus people. So at the end of the day, you're not really evaluating what does the computer science department at that school like. You're evaluating what is my research group like and what is my advisor like. And whenever you start looking at that different granularity, you might start contradicting what the traditional ranking of computer science programs is. So I think that's a really important caveat to keep in mind, that yes, you should think about what is the general reputation of the school, but you should first consider what is the reputation of the advisor I would be working with and what is the reputation of the research group I would be working with, because that is vastly more important in the computer science PhD space than the name brand of the school.
Gotcha.
Let me say now that law schools are almost entirely the opposite.
Really?
There is a ranking of law schools, and that ranking very accurately reflects the caliber of the law school that you go to. Which is to say, there are a variety of really good law programs, but I think that law schools in general have a much longer tail, and you should really try to be closer to the top of the law school ranking list if possible. And the reason for this kind of makes sense, right? Law programs are primarily the classes that you take. So you take this variety of classes, you get graded, and you learn things.
So it's more traditional to like undergrad, or more similar to undergrad than it is to PhD.
Yeah, and just in general, it's like Amazon reviews, you know, like these classes are great. I learned a lot. And at the end of the day, they're just evaluating the classes writ large at that law school. Law schools are also like pretty small in general. So I think that there's definitely like this culture thing that you have to keep in mind depending on the field. And computer science PhDs rankings, I really want to emphasize, I don't think matter to people who have been in the field for a while, because they recognize that advisors matter much more. And I don't think that's true in law schools, because law as a field is much more like pretentious about like the name brand of the school that you went to. So anyways, so at the end of the day, Jonathan Mayer gave me some really good advice, which was look at rankings for law schools, look at PhD advisor fit for PhD programs, and then make trade-offs based on the PhD advisor fit. Because at the end of the day, the PhD is a person, the PhD is the degree that will occupy a much larger portion of your time. So I already knew my first choice PhD program was Princeton. When I was accepted, that was really great news. And I like hooted and hollered and everything was great. In terms of law schools, again, I was accepted at a variety of law schools and I was rejected from a variety of law schools. So definitely, again, there's this like idea of like, you will face failures at some point in the process of applying to grad schools. And like, you just have to recognize that like, that's not a reflection of who you are. It's just a reflection of like what the needs of that school were that year. So definitely like, you might see people getting into all of these great schools around you, but like, remember that their situation is like not the same as yours. And also remember that they are also facing the same setbacks that you are facing. You just might not recognize it at the time. So yeah, so I knew I wanted to go to Princeton as my first choice PhD program. Harvard was the highest ranked law school that I was accepted at. And I'm not upset with that ranking. Like I'm very happy with Harvard. I will say that like, there is kind of like tiers of law schools, which I don't really want to get into in like a public forum like this. Like, I think you can Google it for the most part.
Sure.
But like within those tiers, like I think that there's a number of schools that are like very good, and like anything within those schools is like an excellent law school experience. And I'm confident to say that Harvard is like within that tier of schools. So I'm very happy. And then the question came like, okay, another huge thing. PhDs are paid for. You do not pay tuition. You are in fact paid a salary or like a stipend, or like you're paid money. Like you're paid money to do the research, because it is a research apprenticeship. Like you are doing research for 6 years in order to continue doing research for the rest of your life. And like you might get paid less now than you do 6 years from now, but at the end of the day, your job is the same and they're paying you to be doing your job for those 6 years. Law school, again, very different. You are not producing any work, you are just learning and consuming knowledge from these classes, and as a result, you pay for it. So this can create kind of different trade-offs. Like depending on your financial situation, most PhD programs are kind of the same. Like you're gonna get, from any reputable PhD program, you're going to get paid to be there. You're gonna get paid some reasonable amount for the cost of living of where that school is. And it's gonna be like a reasonable amount that you can live on. Might be like, depending on your financial situation, harder or easier to save up for, you know, retirement, et cetera, or pay back any loans that you may have from undergrad. But at the end of the day, like it is a salary that you will get paid, and you can be confident that that will cover your day-to-day life. Law school, very different. You have to pay for it, and like you have to be in a financial position to pay for it, and like you pretty much like a vast majority of law students take out loans to pay for their law schools. There are very few opportunities to get a full ride to law school. With that being said, they do exist. Willing to talk about that more. In general, if you're getting into schools that are ranked here, the schools that are ranked here might pay you to attend this school instead of this school.
Right.
I think that like conceptually makes sense for most people.
It makes sense. Some undergrad schools are also like that.
Yeah, so it really comes down to like a analysis of like, what is your financial situation and are you willing to pay to be up here, or do you have to recognize that like realistically it makes much more sense for your career trajectory long term to take the school down here, which is still an excellent school and still might be able to provide everything you need out of the legal education. So anyways, taking a step back, PhD programs, not like that. You get paid, everything's great, everybody's happy. So yeah, so I will be paying to go to Harvard in case that was not clear. In general, I think the top 3 schools like don't really, in general, offer like full rides really. Right. So yeah, so going to Princeton, going to Harvard, reached out to, well, Princeton already knew, right? Jonathan Mayer was my potential PhD advisor. I had been talking to him since literally fall of 2020 about doing this. He was very much on the same page about me trying to get into the best law school I could go to and go there. Harvard, when I got in, I was like, hey, I also mentioned it in my interview actually. So I mentioned like, oh yeah, I'm applying to PhD programs as well, and I'm hoping to do a joint program, and that was really helpful. So when I got in, they were like, hey, like what PhD programs did you get into? And I was like, oh, I got into my first choice, like, and they were like, yeah, let's do it. Like everything works out super great. So I'll be doing a joint program. Logistically, I was originally planning to go to law school for a year first in order to learn about the field that was less familiar to me. Because of coronavirus, I don't want to be taking classes online. I would rather be doing like research online, remotely, / not really remotely. So I will be going to Princeton first for a year, and then after that, going to Harvard for a year. And then after that, I have no idea what the logistics will look like.
Okay. So about that, that's actually one of the other points I was curious about, the logistics. So did Princeton have any reservations about the fact that you would be leaving them for a year in the middle, or?
So having a PhD advisor who is on board with you doing both programs made this very easy, because if Princeton expressed any reservations, they did not express it to me. They had expressed it to my PhD advisor, and he was able to smooth out any of the logistical bumps. In general, I think this is true of PhD programs, which is that your advisor is kind of your administrative spokesperson. So they will be the person responsible for getting you funding. They will be the person responsible for a lot of your logistical needs when you're at the university. Another thing that I should mention for PhD programs is that some applicants know that they want to apply to very specific people. Some applicants are like, hey, I don't really know what I want to do. I don't know anything, you know, like I just want to show up and start doing research and try out a bunch of things. So a lot of schools have like rotation programs where you do like 3 months with one professor, 3 months with another professor, 3 months with another professor, and then you like pick one. There's a lot of different strategies for finding PhD advisors even after you show up at a school. So it's kind of different. And like one thing to keep in mind is that some schools allow you to be funded for your first year independent of an advisor. So there's no specific advisor who is paying for your funding to be there. Other schools, your funding is attached to the professor that you work with. So when you show up, you have to have a professor who's willing to vouch for you and be like, yes, that is going to be my student. I'm going to pay their bills. Just something to keep in mind in terms of PhD programs. So yeah, I don't think Princeton had any reservations. Princeton recognizes that it doesn't have a law school. They're not like, there's no competition there. I don't think they minded.
Well, great. Yeah, that answers my question. I think the last question I have, so the idea, of course, with your plan is that at some point you will have completed both degrees, right? And correct me if I'm wrong here, but the PhD is more suited towards academia and finishing grad school. And maybe is the JD more suited towards becoming a lawyer or going towards industry or becoming a law professor or?
Yeah, so I would say that the current career trajectory I'm on leaves me with a lot of options. I don't think I've closed any doors other than the fact that I have kind of committed my 20s to being in school. Yeah, so in terms of, so one thing worth noting is that like law degrees are historically seen as like the generalist degree. So there's lawyers who do a lot of things. They go into politics, they go into publishing like recipe books, they go into like whatever they want. PhDs are obviously the opposite of that. They're archetypically like you will do research in the field that you do your PhD in for the rest of your life. So yeah, they are definitely suited for different things. I also don't know what I want to do 9 years down the line. And I'm kind of hoping to figure that out somewhere along the process of doing all of
Which I think that's totally fair. I mean, who knows what they're doing a decade in advance.
Yeah, I'm not super in a huge hurry to figure out what my next steps are because I don't know anything. Like I'm such a tabula rosa that can be filled with like whatever my graduate education is like. Mm-hmm. In general, I think that people who go into PhDs are interested in doing research long-term. And if you're not interested in doing research long-term, perhaps a PhD is not the right fit for you.
Right.
That's kind of the conventional wisdom.
Okay. And this might be an unfair question, but realistically, do you see yourself finding a career that allows you to use both of them generously, like use both your law and PhD CS education?
Yeah, so I had to like convince a lot of people that this was like a good idea before I was accepted at all of these fancy schools, right? And they asked me like, what are you going to do afterwards? And I had to have like a pretty convincing response for them. The answer that I gave them and the answer that I'll give you is like an example of a field that would meld both of these very well is, for example, computer security for the government. Obviously, the government is a large bureaucratic system, and having a law degree can kind of help you work with the government and like kind of get the government operating the way that you want it to be. And like law is an excellent tool for doing that. And then once you have the government kind of at your reins, like knowing what to do with the government and like knowing how they should be handling all of their computer security needs is something that you need deep technical expertise for. And you need to have studied these problems in a graduate environment. So I think having kind of both of those levers to pull on will make me very well qualified to do something like a computer security for government job, like heading an agency or something like that.
Oh, wow. I mean, it seems like you do have at least part of it figured out. So, I mean, yeah, I think you're probably going to be fine. Yeah, hopefully you find something new in the next 9 years. But even if you don't, like that option is just fantastic, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, I think, is there anything else that you'd like to add? I think I am fresh out of specific questions.
Yeah, just like kind of a word of encouragement is that like it can seem unconventional to go to grad school of any sort. And that's for good reason, but just like a word of encouragement for people out there who are interested in doing it, kind of try it out, like see what you can do, take a couple of steps and like just keep your options open and really like go for it. One thing that I'll say is that like it can seem like you need to like plan out a bunch of intermediate steps before you get to where you want to go, but really try to find the shortest path and be like, look, if I want to be doing this, what do I need to be doing now to be doing that? So like, for example, I wanted to be helping people who are not just computer programmers. And I was like, okay, I can like, go work in industry. I can go get a PhD and then like maybe try to help people. But at the end of the day, I realized like what I really needed was a law degree. And so I tried to figure out like, okay, how do I get there? So yeah, just like find the shortest path to where you want to be, go for it. And even if it seems unconventional, like this is your word of encouragement that like the world will conspire to help you if you try to do what you want to do.
Fantastic. Very well said. I believe we have an audience question.
Yeah, I can read it out. For people who are also interested in using their technological skills for societal problems and feel similarly about industry, what other avenues would you recommend looking into?
Yeah, so one thing that I will say, okay, I've thought about this a lot, right? So I have a couple of things. Off the top of my head, one thing, consider not being a computer scientist, which is like the most unconventional thing. I couldn't bring myself to think of doing that, like abandoning computer science entirely. Like I totally get that. But recognize that the point that we're at in society today, people idolize the idea of computer science. They view people who have technical degrees as like, they put them up on these pedestals. And you can maybe leverage that to your advantage and break into fields that traditionally you didn't think were interested in computer science degrees. So if you see something that you really want to be doing, figure out what you need to do and like go start doing that. So for example, I wanted to be a lawyer. Turns out law school people are like really obsessed with the idea of people with technical backgrounds, and they're, falling over themselves to find more technical people to apply to law school. So that's great. Secondly, maybe you're like, okay, look, I just spent 4 years getting this computer science degree. I'm not about to just throw it away on pivoting to something that's completely unrelated. That's fair. So then the question is like, okay, using computer science, or at least recognizing that my primary jobs, my primary skills are in computer science jobs, then you can start asking yourself like, okay, what field of societal problems am I interested in working on? So for example, you're interested in working on criminal justice. There are companies out there who are doing all of the algorithms and doing all of the things that need to be done for criminal justice systems. And there might be a way to be working at those companies and kind of addressing the issues in those companies. Another thing is that you can look at kind of organizations that advocate on behalf of societal issues. So for example, there's the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, which advocates for a lot of these things, and they're looking for computer scientists. The third is that all of these big tech companies very much pull the levers that govern our society, right? So like working from the inside, there might be roles in Google, Facebook, Amazon, etc., that can help you. So I know, for example, one of my friends, Abhi Krishnan, she worked in this really interesting role at Facebook as like a policy computer science person. I don't really understand what her internship was, but it sounded awesome. Like it was this great combination of she was in DC doing Facebook stuff on the policy side, but also as a computer scientist. And it was just really great. So there are these kind of like opportunities to be leveraging your expertise in a way that can be addressing these societal problems. And then the kind of like the cop-out answer is that like you can do your job and do everything else on the side. And I always kind of hated this answer because it was like you're really gonna just make me be out here doing 2 jobs. Like I'm gonna do a full-time job and then like after that job do something else as a job. Yeah. But anyways, I mean, there are people who do it, right? There are people who have really, really intense passions in things, recognize that they, for financial reasons or other reasons, have to just get a normal computer science software engineering job, do that, and then find a way to pursue their advocacy in other domains, like weekends, going to marches, like stuff like that, organizing, stuff like that. And finally, if you don't feel super comfortable in industry, I will plug that there might be computer science research opportunities. And I'm like trying to redefine what computer science research looks like, because there are all these societal problems that I want to spend 6 years working on that might not traditionally be like optimize the CPU to run 5 cycles faster. But like at the end of the day, I consider them very relevant to the field of computer science. So there might be ways to find professors who are interested in this. Oh, for example, I know someone who I met on one of my visit days for a PhD program was doing really interesting work in basically like the way that for-profit companies provide communication services for people to do visitation while they're incarcerated. And he was like, oh, these things are like terrible. Like they like, if you call a prison, your phone will be tracked for like 24 hours after you call the prison. Like that's terrible. Someone needs to talk about that. And so he was able to find ways to do that research from a computer science perspective. There's things like one of the professors that I applied to for PhD program, he's doing really interesting work in domestic violence and designing systems where you recognize that there might be a bad actor who has physical access to the user's phones. And like, you can't give all of the information to someone who might be trying to harm the legitimate user. So there's like really interesting like human computer interaction things like, oh, how do we design systems for a broader range of communities? There are people who, you know, can't necessarily use the technologies as they're designed right now. For example, kids. Like the settings page of like smart home devices should be set differently because kids are a different type of user than is typically designed for. So there's a lot of ways, there's a lot of research directions, and it kind of depends on what your personal interests are and trying to explore how that can intersect with technology. That's what I'm trying to do right now. I'm trying to find out like, what is my research going to look like? And I'm having a lot of trouble with it. It's a hard problem, but I think it really takes, oh, one thing I can super suggest, read research, read literature, read everything from fields other than your own. So like for me, there's so much sociology that goes into the criminal justice system, and they are so much better at expressing some of the criminal justice issues than computer scientists ever will be. And they're like light years ahead because they've spent years researching this. So there are books out there on the things you're interested in, like go read those, go listen to those scholars and kind of like be humble and like recognize that there are scholars who have already researched what you're interested in. There's this concept of techno-chauvinism, which comes from the word chauvinism, but basically means that like, oh, technology can solve everything. And like, that's not always true. And so just like being humble and recognizing that there are problems out there that don't need computers to solve them. And in fact, computers can actually hinder solving them. So avoiding techno-chauvinism is another kind of like thing that mentally is really helpful for addressing societal issues and recognizing that computers might not be the solution.
Okay, wow, I think that covered. A follow-up question just based on what you just said. Do you know if any professors at UT specifically doing research like this, that cross-functional, cross-disciplinary kind of research?
No.
I know
Fair,
of
yeah.
one.
I think that UT computer science, if I may say this, is very focused on hiring explicitly technical researers, which is fair. That's a design decision that they've made. One thing that I will say, note of encouragement, don't just look at the computer science department. One of my biggest like mentors in this whole time was Professor Robert Chesney, who is a law professor. I know a lot of people who are working in like neuroscientist professors. Like there are, you know, we have an entire African-American studies department. We have an entire women and gender studies department. We have an entire sociology department. So go and maybe look outside the box a little bit and look for professors who are not necessarily in the computer science department, because from what I have experienced, computer science professors are very focused on making their CPU cycles 5 times faster or whatever.
Sure.
That's kind of my word of wisdom, but like low key, no. Like computer security, there are people doing computer security, which was like the closest I could find, but.
Right.
I was thinking that one guy who did computer science and neuroscience. I think his name was Huth or something. But I mean that's still like two very technical fields, right? It's not really as out there.
Yeah.
I also know that this isn't like social like specifically, but I know like the linguistics department does a lot of interesting NLP stuff.
Yeah.
It's also something to look into. It's just cross-disciplinary interests.
Yeah.
Okay. We do not have another question in the chat.
We'll wait a few seconds, maybe
Yeah.
a minute or so, and then we can call it a night. So how's life?
Pretty good.
Oh, good. I'm
In
glad to hear that.
Austin. Yeah.
Dude, actually, I'm curious to hear about this. This is not necessarily related to what you talked about a little bit, kind of. But like, are you has Princeton made a decision about what's going to be happening in the fall? Like, are you working from home or?
Yeah, so Harvard has officially announced that they will be entirely online. I deferred before I knew that decision, but I'm like very happy that I made the decision when I did. Princeton has not announced. I think I will probably end up moving to Princeton regardless, because I think that's just where like the network of people that I should be talking to on a day-to-day basis are. And so I think that just makes sense for me. Also, it's closer to like the Northeast, which is where I'm originally from. So I will be moving to Princeton pretty much regardless, but I have a hunch that even if classes are canceled, there might be still like small group meetings or something like that, which might be allowed to be in person.
Similar to what UT is probably doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I don't think we have any
Yeah.
chat questions.
All right. Well, congratulations once again, Rushi, and thank you so much for coming to speak to us. Guys, if you ever have any questions that you want me to forward to Rushi, please feel free to Slack Kusher me, and we'll be happy to do that for you. I'm sure Rushi will be happy to answer. Yeah.
But anyway, maybe make my email available, and people can definitely email me if they have any questions.
Yeah. Okay. We will drop his email on the Slack as well. But anyway, thank you everybody for tuning in, and have a good night.